I have a long speech. I won't give it. Prepared it earlier, and I'll be very brief. But let me again thank the leadership of so many wonderful, particularly Chinese leaders who have suffered so much, starting even before Tiananmen Square, but certainly during and after. Wei Jingsheng, I met him in Beijing when he was let out in the early 1990s before being rearrested. And I'll never forget just being in awe of his bravery. He was given his very temporary freedom then to try to get Olympics 2000. He was such a high value political prisoner. And he was brave and very, very clear about the weakness of the West, including the United States, and made the point that when you coddle and kowtow, it only empowers and enables a dictatorship like Beijing and China to do its terrible misdeeds. We remember the Tiananmen Square dead, those women and men who lost their lives, but we also remember those who suffered in the Laogai and in prison camps throughout China. They were rounded up and mistreated, some of whom then made their way out and escaped in daring exoduses from China. It was mentioned earlier about how they continue to deny to this day what happened in Tiananmen Square. I remember when President Clinton, and I thought this was a very noble act on his part, invited Che Haitian, then the defense minister of China, who was the butcher of Beijing, to the White House, gave him a 19-gun salute. And while he was in Washington, Che Haitian said, "Nobody died at Tiananmen Square." I put together a hearing within 2 days, invited Che Haitian and anyone else from the embassy who would like to come, give an accounting for such a blatant lie about the deaths that they said didn't occur. Instead, he got a 19-gun salute and White House honors. I, to this day, shudder at that. I do believe that both parties have made huge mistakes in the United States and have thought that if we just trade more, somehow they would matriculate, they being the Communist Party, from a brutal entity to a somehow or benign entity. That has not happened. Xi Jinping, in my humble opinion, continues the horrific legacy of Tiananmen Square each and every day. Again, the martyrs of Tiananmen Square showed the way. Unfortunately, the Communist Party has chosen the polar opposite. Look what's happening to the Uyghurs, as was mentioned earlier. The Uyghur human rights bill is on its way to the White House. It was enrolled yesterday in the Capitol, and I was there for that. The Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, another manifestation of brutality on the part of Xi Jinping. And we know that he and his ilk are orchestrating all of this dictator for life. And even COVID-19 is a further manifestation of the big lie repeated often enough. And in this case, they deceived first the WHO and Dr. Tedros, who runs it, into putting out false narratives about COVID-19. And then they continue to this day to deny any kind of disinformation campaign. And in my state, we've got over 11,000 dead. I've met with many of those who have lost loved ones. Our country, the United States, has lost many, and of course, worldwide, all because of this terrible virus of hate that was unleashed by the Communist Party when they had an opportunity at Tiananmen Square to embrace reforms and to start going down the road of reform. So I want to just thank all of you. We all know that religious freedom of every kind, Falun Gong, Christians, Tibetan Buddhists, Muslim Uyghurs, every faith is now under a siege, the likes of which we have not seen since Mao Zedong. And the whole process of synodization, of getting faith and religions to comport with Xi Jinping's nightmare, or find themselves tortured and horribly mistreated. Let me just say finally, if only our high-tech industries, even Cisco, we're at a Cisco website, a WebEx, I should say, meeting, using their technology. I had a hearing back in 2006. We had Google, Microsoft, Cisco, and Yahoo, and they were enabling the dictatorship as few can enable. I started off by talking about how IBM had enabled the Nazis. They helped to find where the Jewish people were, to track them down. And there was a book, actually, that I read before the hearing called IBM and the Holocaust. Fast forward to today, our high-tech companies have enabled this dictatorship to do horrific things to democracy activists, religious believers. And again, the legacy of Tiananmen Square, in my humble opinion, will be, we will honor those heroes someday, and you who are putting this together tonight and have been unbelievably heroic there and now, we will honor you for a new China that will emerge, that is democratic and respectful of fundamental, universally recognized human rights. So thank you for this remembrance. And that prayer earlier in this webinar that was offered, how beautiful that was. We need to pray for China. Pray for the people who are suffering, and even pray for the oppressors, that they will have a change of heart. Thank you so very much for allowing me to be on.
Terrific. Mr. Chairman and dear friends of China, thank you for all of the organizers, all of the people who've taken part, are speaking tonight, have spoken. Jane has given me strict instructions on how long I can speak for, and there's so much to say, but I will keep it to the limit she's given me, and thank you for listening. 31 years ago today, hardliners in Beijing ordered the military to crush a pro-democracy demonstration in Tiananmen Square, as we all know, ending the longest and largest protest in modern Chinese history. The protests weren't in Beijing only, but also in about 200 other cities, communities across the country. For 7 weeks, people had filled the square seeking to improve human rights, build democracy, and end corruption. The movement attracted up to 1 million supporters in the capital alone. There was a sense of invincibility. Somehow they were on the cusp of major change. Tragically, the People's Liberation Army, actually it was the party's Liberation Army, then and now, rolled in to crush their dreams. The Statue of Liberty was toppled. The most credible estimates of deaths now appear to be about 10,000 human beings. I give my source at the bottom of my notes, which I'll send. Soldiers unleashed fire, clearing the square and forcing everyone to run for their lives. Brave protesters carried the wounded any way they could, but many could not escape. The world outside China watched the terrible events. Tank men, the icon of resistance, initially won the battle, but violence continued for days. The uprising had a profound effect in China, as we all know, in its relations with the rest of the world. There will be no doubt no reporting of Tiananmen's legacy today in Beijing or anywhere else across China, no doubt. It's incumbent on the democratic world to remember those who were murdered and the survivors who witnessed it. The panicked protesters struggling on bicycles or on foot to carry their bloodied friends to hospitals. A gun-happy soldier shooting quickly 3 young female students kneeling down in front of him, and then an old man. An eyewitness doctor who'd been ordered to stay home, heard the shooting and screams, and resolved to return to her hospital to help the injured. Drawing near, she could see through the windows bodies being stacked like cordwood inside. The experience led her to flee China forever, trying to erase this memory of this site. And on and on. We must continue our vigils and prayers for the victims and survivors of Tiananmen. We must not let these images die. During the decade following 1989, the Falun Gong movement emerged partly thanks to government support, growing to 70 to 100 million persons across China by the government's own estimates. In July of 99, it became almost overnight the target of a massive persecution by the Communist Party, an ongoing campaign that continues to include organ harvesting from non-consenting practitioners. Since 2017, as you know, an estimated 1 to 3 million Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, Turkestan, have been thrown into what are in reality concentration camps similar to the Nazi ones. There are strong indications that some of them are being used as involuntary organ donors, in quotation marks, as labor for products made in Xinjiang and sold in democracies. Under Xi, the persecution of Christians, as Bob Fu mentioned, is also intensifying, including those known as house Christians. Tibetans, we all know, with a clear sense of ethno-cultural identity and a belief that they deserve at least greater autonomy, are under harsh suppression. CCP now also believes that to counter democracy, the rule of law must stir up nationalism. That's another ongoing tragedy of Tiananmen, because in the last 3 decades, we've seen moderate technocratic reformists, but we haven't seen many within the CCP championing political reform as the leaders in the 1980s did. As we know, Xi Jinping now seeks to keep China unified by keeping its 50+ cultural communities under heel and continuing his great leap backwards. And all of us meeting today across the world hope that the legacies of the brave people at Tiananmen continue to serve as inspiration for present and future Chinese reformers. Thank you, everybody. Xi.
Thank you, Mr. David Kelga.
Thank you, everybody.
That's great. Can you speak English? Can you speak Chinese?
I wish I could. You can speak it for me, but I think that somebody is coming on right after me to speak. Aren't they from Toronto? Xu Xuan?
Thank you.
Sorry,
Thank you. 我们现在是在纪念1989年民主运动和六四屠杀31周年全球网。
The most important thing I think I have to tell you, as the regime has interfered with this broadcast, as it doesn't go perfectly, is not to worry about it. I want to teach you, and I want everybody to understand a lesson of how history is made. People think that you make history by taking one step and climbing to the next, then the next, then the next, until you reach success. That's wrong. That's almost never how history is made. History is made by people like you, feeling lonely, feeling as if nobody is listening to you, getting sad that you make strong efforts and they don't seem to come to anything. But you know what you do, and David just did it. You keep the flame flickering. And as you do it, going for long periods of time when nobody seems to be listening, holding demonstrations like this, which the regime ignores, suddenly, somehow, not magically, but in a real way, overnight, what became impossible, what was impossible, becomes inevitable, becomes certain. That's how the regime in the Soviet Union fell. That's how all great revolutions take place. And when they take place, the people who make it happen are people like you, struggling with broadcasts like this, worrying that nobody's listening to what you have to say. You keep the flame flickering, and the end is certain. And you are heroes for doing it, for having the courage to continue to fight when it seems as if you're all alone. One of the things that Ronald Reagan taught me during the years in the White House was, and this is another point for you to understand, not just to make speeches about it, to cheer yourselves up, but to deeply understand with everything in you. Democracies, said Reagan, always seem to be divided, always seem to be weak, always seem to be fighting with each other. Whereas dictatorships always seem strong and unified, and they always speak with just one voice. Don't ever be confused, said Reagan, about that seeming difference. Because democracies are strong and they adapt to change, whereas dictatorships at the core are weak and fragile and fall overnight, as I've just said. Think of the great oak tree. It stands as stronger and taller than any other tree, but then a strong wind comes along and this great tree is the first to fall. And when you look at the root of the oak tree after it's fallen, it's as if this great tree is held to the ground by shoelaces. The roots are really not strong. And that's the lesson. All of this talk, all of this seeming strength really masks weakness and vulnerability on the part of the Chinese regime. Let me say one other thing. What you are doing is more important than perhaps you imagine. Am I being heard now, Jane?
Yes.
What you are doing is vital, because the 21st century will be defined by whether China is free. If China is a dictatorship, the 21st century can be more bloody than the 20th century has been. And if China is free and democratic, China and the United States and Canada will compete with each other about who makes the best cars or television sets or computers. And it will be a glorious golden period in the life of the world. So that the battle you are fighting is the battle not only for yourselves, it's not only for the people in China, it's for my grandchildren, it's for everybody. It will determine the nature of the world in the 21st century. And as I say, you're going to win. And one of the reasons you're going to win, and Hitler made this clear, is dictatorships always go one step too far. They think that democracies are weak and they can get anything they want. So they cover up COVID. Okay, the world is struggling. Well, they think, well, let me take over, while the West is struggling, I think I'm going to take over Hong Kong. Hitler took over Czechoslovakia, and he thought, well, the West was weak. Let me take over Hungary. Let me take over Poland. And that began World War II, and 4 years later, the Nazi regime was over. I think, and let me tell you, and Bob said that I am working on one thing in particular, and that is the collapse of the Great Firewall of China. I can tell you that I have fought for years to get senior people in the United States government to really begin to take down the firewall. The technology is there. Many Falun Gong practitioners are leading the way to do it, but they're getting no support. And there are many reasons for that. Bureaucratic reasons and appeasement of China is another reason. And we have fought the fight to give support to some of the systems that are working. We have fought for research and development money to develop tools that will bypass the firewalls. And we just kept alive and nothing much has happened. But let me tell you something, and this is the great news. And this is going to be, I will tell you, I do believe that Xi Jinping is going to regret what he did in Hong Kong, not because of the economic sanctions that the president announced, but because I think it has created, and I can tell you, it has created strength and unity within Washington to tear down the firewalls. How important is that? Don't take my word for it. Hu Jintao said, if I cannot maintain the purity of the internet, is what he called it, I cannot maintain the stability of the socialist regime. They understand dictatorships survive because they control and isolate their people. But think about whether people in China have the complete freedom to discuss what they want with you and with me. At that point, and again, don't take my word, Xi Jinping said it, Hu Jintao said it. At that point, the power of the regime begins to disappear. Now, let me tell you the good news further. Right now, as we speak, there are senior people in the United States government that are drafting up plans to begin for the first time to apply tens and maybe hundreds of millions of dollars to projects to tear down the firewall in China. And by the way, it'll tear down the firewalls in Iran and in North Korea and in Venezuela at the same time. The internet is a very disruptive instrument, but it is the instrument of freedom. It disrupts our life, but it destroys the regimes. That's the great power of the internet, and the regimes know it. Finally, senior people in the United States government are beginning to understand it. So we now have technology available that will allow anybody in a net cafe in Tehran to be no different from somebody in a Starbucks in Ottawa. The technology will allow communication throughout the world. One of the things about firewall circumvention technology is that for every dollar we spend to breach the firewalls, the Chinese have got to spend $1,000 to try and keep the firewalls going, and they will not succeed. There are a few Falun Gong systems that they've spent $1 billion trying to destroy, and they haven't affected them. The problem is that those systems have not gotten enough money to buy servers and IP addresses. Well, that money is going to be coming. And here's what I think is going to happen. And maybe, if we keep working, will happen in a matter of months. There will be a prayer service in which 500, begins in the United States, in some city in the United States, in which 500,000 house church Christians worship. The world will be a different place the day after that service. There will be a town meeting, an interactive town meeting between the President of the United States and 200,000 young Iranians with their smartphones. The next day that can happen. The world will be a different thing when that occurs. And I'm telling you, it is going to happen. And now let me conclude by telling you the really great news that hasn't been reported by the press, which doesn't understand this. The press thinks that the firewall is 10 feet tall and nobody can touch it. They don't understand that we haven't attacked it, and we're beginning to now. On the 27th of May, just a few weeks ago, less than 2 weeks ago, a statement was made by Secretary Pompeo, which none of the press has reported, and I'm glad they haven't. I want to read it to you, because it is now the policy of the United States. The U.S. stands against, said Secretary Pompeo, and will not tolerate government-imposed internet shutdowns and other forms of censorship during or after the pandemic. We join the call to promote and protect internet freedom at all times. That is now the stated policy of the United States, and some of us have worked for 10 years to get the Secretary of State or the President to say it. Now, you saw the President's speech about Hong Kong, where he talked about economic sanctions, and they're all very good and they're powerful. Nothing was in there about firewalls, because when that comes, it's going to come as an explosion. It's going to come as a payback to Xi Jinping for what he's done in COVID and Wuhan, for what he's doing in Hong Kong right now. And to take his word for it, the stability of the regime cannot survive a free internet. So we're working very hard with Bob Fu, with people like Chris Smith, and those people now working inside the State Department, inside government agencies to tear down the firewalls. I tell you, I think that it's going to come louder and faster than people imagine. And its impact will be the very impact that the dictators have predicted. They know better than we have up to now, and now we know what they know. Our policymakers know what they know, which is they will not survive a free internet. It is the most powerful tool available to the free world, and we are about to unleash that tool. Thank you, Xi Jinping. That's your thank you for Hong Kong. That's your thank you for the COVID cover-up, because if they hadn't happened, I wouldn't have been able to get the support that we are now receiving that has led to the Secretary of State making this statement. So I want you to be of good cheer. The future is our future. The fact that this is a difficult time and the Chinese garbled up your language, it's unimportant because David lit that little candle. The flame is flickering, and that's what creates the revolution. And that day is going to come, just like it did with the Soviet Union, where everybody was saying the Soviet Union are so powerful. And overnight, and by the way, what made the Soviet Union fall? Yes, it was Reagan's missiles, but you know what else? It was fax machines. Machines brought down the Soviet Union. Just the internet will bring down very powerfully and very quickly the regime in China. So thank you, and thank you for all of the work and the prayers and the lonely efforts you're making, because you're going to make a better world for my grandchildren. So I can't thank you enough. Thank you.
刚才是原